Hello everyone, it's Tom here. We've got another brilliant episode of Last Orders lined up for you today. But before we get into that, I've got a very special announcement to make. And that is that Spiked's internship program is back this summer. Once again, we're offering paid 6-month placements to aspiring writers, podcasts and video makers, anyone who wants to cut their teeth at the best political magazine in the world. Successful applicants will work here at Spiked full-time for 6 months in our offices in London. It starts from this July, and there's also the possibility of more work at the end of it. There are 2 different tracks available. You can either apply for an editorial internship where you'd help us to produce our articles, features and essays, or there's an audio-visual internship where you'd help us to produce our podcasts just like this one. Applicants have until Friday the 16th of June to send in their applications, so don't delay if you're interested. To find out more and about how to apply, just go to spiked-online.com/interns. That's spiked-online.com/interns. Once again, you have until Friday the 16th of June to get those applications in. Thanks so much, and now on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast all about freedom and the Nanny State. In this episode, we discuss Coco Pops' hysteria, George Osborne's call to ban smoking, and Australia's voice to Parliament. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode all the way down the line from Shoreham by Sea in West Sussex. Chris Snowdon, how you doing, Chris?
Delighted to be back once again. Never missed an episode. The proverbial bad smells.
We're also delighted to be joined. Second time on the show, I believe, all the way from Sydney in New South Wales, Australia, Nick Cater. Nick, thanks for joining us on the show again today.
A delight and a pleasure to be with you chaps. Yeah.
So there's plenty that we're going to get into here, but let's start with gambling, Chris, because this is something that we've touched on the show probably less than other kind of Nanny State issues, but it's back with a bit of a vengeance in the UK with the publication of the government's white paper on gambling. Basically, it's kind of setting out its stall for what they want to legislate for in relation to gambling. Do you want to take us through some of the kind of core things that are in that particular white paper and what you make of them?
Yeah, so this goes way back to December 2020 when the government issued a call for evidence. It wasn't really a public consultation because it wasn't consulting on any specific policies. And it just felt pressure, even though we're in the midst of the pandemic, it felt pressure to do something about gambling. And its excuse for doing it was that, things have changed since 2007 when the previous Gambling Act had come in. I mean, 13 years really isn't that long, right? But they said, we now everyone's got smartphones, so that changes things in some way. And then the anti-gambling people came up with a whole load of policies. Right, let's ban gambling sponsorship in sport, let's ban gambling advertising, none of which had anything to do with smartphones, just that they've never liked it, they don't like gambling. And they wanted to have like a deposit limit, so you can't spend more than £100 a month, and they wanted bans on VIP deals and free bets and all sorts of things. And then nothing happened. And I believe it's right that we went through 10 gambling ministers between then and now, such has been the stability of government. And so last week, the latest Minister Lucy Fraser came out with some policies that were kind of annoying, but in a way, the anti-gambling people didn't really get that much of what they wanted. I thought they were going to scream blue murder and say, the government's capitulated to the gambling industry, blah, 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 it's not good enough, it's too little too late. But they were fairly happy with it, actually. The main policies are, firstly, stake limits on online slots. So that's like online fruit machines. And there's going to be a stake limit between £2 and £15. Well, to be honest, that's fine with me, really. There's not that many people play for more than even £2, except for like the occasional extravagance. So I don't think that makes much of a difference to anything. Then we've got the affordability checks. This is where it gets interesting because the gambling companies are the only companies in the world I can think of that are expected to know whether their customers can afford what they're paying for. Just the fact that they've got money and they are using it up front doesn't seem to be sufficient evidence. So they're required to do checks on people, and they get blamed when somebody gets into debt. And of course, it's very difficult to know whether people can genuinely afford the product, whatever that means. You can ring them up, and sometimes they do ring punt us up and say, look, are you sure you're all right? You spent £1,000 this week. Can you afford it? But if the guy says, yes, I can, there's not a lot they can do about it. So the government wants to beef these up, I think, really, but in a very vague way. So they said they're going to do it. They said they're going to have affordability checks at really quite low levels. I mean, very low levels, actually. So if you spend more than £125 a month on gambling, it will trigger an affordability check. Well, that's nothing. I've done that lots of times, right? And also some months won more than £125, but they don't look at that side of the equation. So there's going to be a lot of affordability checks going on, and no one's quite sure what they're going to involve. The government says they're going to be frictionless, but I'm not quite so sure about it. And the third thing, and this is why I think the anti-gambling people are actually pretty happy with the whole paper, is a tax on gambling companies of probably 1% of their revenue to fund research, education, and treatment. Now, the gambling companies, the big gambling companies, had already committed to that anyway. So in a sense, you think, well, that makes no difference. It does make a difference because the anti-gambling people know they can get their mitts on a lot of this money, right? They're not too bothered about the treatment or even the education. They are keen on the research because they want public health people controlling the research agenda. And this is actually a bit of a turning point in this whole issue, I think, because there's lots of public health people who are itching to get into this gambling space, looking for the grants, and they are going to do to gambling what they've done to smoking. And they're going to produce all sorts of, the kind of junk science we talk about on this show all the time to prove that we basically must have an unending clampdown on gambling, and that it's gambling, not just problem gambling, that is the problem.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, what's your response to all this? What does the picture look like from Australia where kind of gambling is concerned?
The same dynamic is at play. There's the people who want to clamp down on gambling, and the same Nanny State arguments come in. Look, I'm really hate to come in on the first edition of this for some time, but my first answer is on the one hand and on the other. I know that makes a terrible, terrible podcast, but of course, we believe that people should take responsibility for their own actions. But I think when it comes to gambling, there is something in it that brings out the nanny stater in the best of us, I think, because here we have a big problem with poker machines. Most of the pubs have poker machines in the back, and it's like a mini casino. And sometimes you see the people in those sections of the pub, and you feel somewhat sorry for them, really. So I like the idea of the small stakes. We have that here. There's a limit to how much you can actually put in a machine and feed through it at any time. But in the end, a lot of this is going online here, as in the UK, and that's much harder, of course, for the government to deal with. But it does introduce other questions about children and so forth. We've had instances here where gambling-type products have been available to kids on the internet, and that's the fault, I think, of Apple and Google for not imposing those age limits as they have. So that's a very rambling one hand and on the other hand answer from a country where, of course, they will bet on two flies going up a wall. It's always a part of the culture here.
I mean, it's a fair point as well, because obviously everyone's concerned about problem gambling in particular, and as you say, also young people, children being able to get access to any of these online services and such. But Chris, it does seem like, particularly in the UK, the problem gambling level is not only low, but I think it's at a historic low. It's like 0.2% of the population or something actually have a kind of problem with gambling. And yet it seems like these measures, even if they're from the kind of relatively uncontroversial stuff through to the more serious things, are blanket measures naturally. I mean, I was even struck by the fact that there was one idea being mooted of, I think, different stake limits applying to different age groups. So if you're 18 to 24, or whatever, you're not going to be trusted as much as if you're 25 plus. So, is this just about problem gambling, this kind of push, if you like, or has it always been a much kind of broader, we don't like this kind of thing, we find it grubby and we want to stop people from doing it, essentially?
Well, it's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, there's some people who are only concerned about problem gambling. That probably applies to most people, But yeah, there's always been people who are staunchly opposed to gambling. I mean, at any given time, there's at least, I think, a third of the population who quite happily ban gambling altogether, according to surveys, A lot of it, even on the kind of libertarian side of the fence, you meet people who don't really like it. To go, I'm very libertarian about everything except for gambling. And I think partly that's because a lot of libertarians tend to be either economists or kind of steeped in economics. And they just feel that it's obviously a waste of money because the house always wins. So why would you do it? This obviously overlooks welfare economics, by which you pay for something because you enjoy doing it, and you shouldn't look at them as losses. You should look at it as expenditure, as we would with any other leisure activity. The problem gambling rate is really low. 0.2% is incredibly low by international standards, and it's, like you say, it's lower than it's ever been. But the anti-gambling people will never mention this. Funnily enough, if they wanted to say that the previous clampdown on fixed odds betting terminals has been a success, they could point to the fact that problem gambling is a bit lower now than it was then. That they will never do, because it's all forgotten about fixed odds betting terminals. Like with a lot of these issues, as soon as they get a win, they move on to the next thing. They can't at any point let the public think that this problem has in any way got better. And rather than talk about the statistics, because they are so low, they talk always about anecdotes. With the fixed odds betting terminal thing, it was mostly people saying, I lost a lot of money, it was miserable, I lost my job, whatever. This time round, it's been the friends and family of people who've killed themselves who had a gambling problem. And it makes it almost impossible to have a rational debate if you're up against someone whose child died. Because you can't argue with anything they say, really. So these people have really been weaponized, I would say, by the anti-gambling activists to understandably tug on people's heartstrings. But you wouldn't do that if you were trying to ban cars, would you? There's plenty of people die in traffic accidents. You wouldn't do it with alcohol because it's patently unreasonable. And the bigger picture is that a lot of people really enjoy gambling. If you prohibit it, it'll just go underground. And the number of people who have a gambling problem is very small. Most of them don't suffer enormously from having a gambling problem. And frankly, a lot of them, if not the majority of them, are young men who get a bit carried away and then grow out of it.
Mm-hmm. It's the worst form of kind of emotional blackmail, definitely. You see it in the gambling thing. You also see it increasingly with clampdowns on the internet, like the online safety bill. Again, the kind of case of someone like Molly Russell gets wheeled out quite purposely, I think, to try and just kind of browbeat people into particular forms of censorship,
But even also now with Ofsted, right? This whole weird thing with Ofsted. So, Nick, Ofsted is the body that governs schools, or it assesses schools to see what kind of standard they're up to. And their assessment is very important to teachers, obviously. And they can go from outstanding to, very poor in the space of a year, it seems. And this headmistress at a school killed herself after her school was given a poor rating. It was actually only given a poor rating for one aspect, which was safeguarding,
Quite important, really,
Which it's important, but it's not as important as people think from the word safeguarding. It did like the things, as I understand it, the things the school failed on. It wasn't like all the teachers were pedos or something like that. It was just certain boxes hadn't been ticked. And very sadly, she killed herself. But straight away, it was like, we must abolish Ofsted and stop doing school inspections. Well, hang on a minute,
Mm-hmm.
You can't start, shroud waving to that degree. Clearly, schools need to be inspected, and maybe I'm sure there's problems with Ofsted, but just to go from that to let's stop inspecting schools is a bit of a leap.
It's this great safety culture, isn't it? If anybody does anything bad associated with anything, then we must ban that activity altogether. Because we cannot afford the risk of even one person harming themselves or whatever. So it is a crazy thing.
You don't get it with the vaccines, do you? You don't get the BBC trawling around looking for people who've died from the vaccines or been injured by the vaccines to go on and make a point about vaccines.
There's plenty on the internet who do that for them, really.
Well, that is true. That is true. And I'm not suggesting they should be doing that, just to be clear.
They don't need enough encouragement.
But if your attitude is going to be, if it saves one life, then, that's the kind of thing you could do.
Precisely. And whilst we're on the subject of kind of safetyism and so on, Nick, Australia has often been a bit of a kind of laboratory for kind of safetyist nanny state policies. And from what we were talking about just before we started recording here, there's been new developments on the vaping front as well, which, over here and in many other countries has been pretty much embraced to some degree as a kind of alternative to smoking, far less dangerous and so on. But what's been the latest in Australia where vaping is concerned?
Well, the government's finally said it wants to absolutely flat ban vaping. E-cigarettes have been in that category for some time, but vaping now is going to be completely banned. So you'll be in this position where, the really dangerous form of nicotine, which is smoking, that will be available, albeit at a price. I can talk about the price of cigarettes here later. But the because there's not all the evidence is in, but generally from the evidence I've seen, vaping is certainly a less harmful, less risky way of absorbing nicotine, and is recognised as a way for which people can wean themselves off cigarettes. Of course, the other argument is it's a gateway drug to cigarettes. I'm not a vapor, but I think this is just crazy stuff when you're actually forcing people to take the most dangerous product, because taxation comes into this. So I mentioned the price of cigarettes. So the government here is proposing to put another $10 on a packet of 20. That'll take the price of a packet of 20 to $50, or about 25 pounds. I remember my wife and I were in a bar in Detroit a few years ago, and a chap came up and he said, "Oh, you're from Australia?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Tell me," he said, they say that cigarettes are $40 a packet there. And I said, "Yeah, that's right." And this guy shouted across the bar, "Hey, there's a guy here from Australia, and cigarettes are $40 a packet in Australia." So it was the one unique thing about Australia that excited him. And I personally have a problem with that, because what's happening, of course, is people are being forced onto essentially illegal tobacco or black market tobacco. The sales of cigarettes are going down, so the government isn't actually getting the windfall revenue it wants from this stuff. And sales of illegal tobacco, which is apparently quite freely available, a lot of it comes in from Indonesia and elsewhere, it's going through the roof. So I'm not sure what they actually achieve through this. And when you get down to the level of smoking that you have here now, which is not much more than 10% of the population, they're very often the people that really have, they're the people at the lowest end of the spectrum, people who, like schizophrenics, for instance. I know a relative of mine who has chronic schizophrenia. She uses cigarettes to self-medicate. A lot of people do in those conditions. So I think they're really at the point where they're really just hurting people who are already really down on their luck and not achieving anything in that field.
And Chris, I'm sure you'll have some views on these latest developments in Australia.
Well, it's just such a clear-cut case of prohibition being a disaster. You can't believe even the Australian government are going to keep doubling down on it, but they do. To be clear, they've always banned real e-cigarettes for nicotine. They've always been illegal, just by default, because you can only have nicotine in tobacco and pharmaceutical products in Australia. And then they banned the importation of them because you can still get them for personal use from abroad. So they banned that. That didn't work. And now they're banning e-cigarettes which don't have any nicotine in them in case somebody tries to put nicotine in them. But apparently, and Nick might correct me on this because I'm only obviously reading this from the news, but e-cigarettes of all varieties are very widely available in Australia from all sorts of shops. There's a massive black market in it. And vaping amongst the under 18s, there's more teenagers of that age have tried e-cigarettes in Australia, where it's always been banned, than in Britain, where it's broadly encouraged, albeit not for children, right? So they've got a much bigger problem with underage vaping, despite having total prohibition, than we have in Britain. It's just remarkable. And then you look at the tobacco black market. The anti-smoking groups have always said, and still say, that the size of the black market's got nothing to do with taxation. It's just about enforcement. I mean, this is obviously untrue, right? But Australia is the most obvious example of this, right? I mean, the Australian Border Force in 2021, when the last figures were available, they seized 897 tons of tobacco and 730 million cigarettes. That's just what they detected. And who knows how much actually gets through. Clearly, the vast majority of it will get through onto the open market. There are regular stories, extraordinary stories from Australia there was one last month, 20-acre farm growing nothing but tobacco, 16 tons of tobacco getting busted. Because obviously they've got the space and the climate to actually grow it there as well as smuggle it in. But the smuggling in is on an incredible scale. I think 50 million bust in one seizure in Sydney. Again, only last month. So this is happening on an epic scale. And rather than learn any lessons from it whatsoever, the government kind of blames big tobacco for marketing vapes to kids in Australia, which obviously it doesn't do. It can't sell vapes. It can't market. No one can market any vapes. And puts up the tax again. So it's going to go up another 5% every year for the next 3 years. It's just insane, but it should be a salutary lesson to the rest of the world.
What are they trying to achieve, Chris? And what is their problem with smoking? They say, well, it creates extra burdens on the health service, but we know that the amount that people pay in tobacco revenue far exceeds any possible extra cost to the health service. And we also know that people die earlier because of cigarettes. Then there's a lot of ambulances they won't be calling after that, a lot of aged care they won't need. There is no logical argument for it, apart from the fact that, I think people should be discouraged from smoking because it's got known harms, increased rate of heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. We kind of know that, but I don't see the justification for this heavy sin tax that they impose. And certainly I can't see it with the vaping because, as we said, all intents and purposes, it's a slightly safer way, or maybe, I don't know by what degree, but it's a safer way of taking in nicotine if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, well, it's just fanaticism, really, isn't it? I mean, there's also a certain amount of national pride at stake because with plain packaging and policies like that, the Aussie government convinced themselves quite wrongly that they were world leaders in tobacco control. And you're quite right that the externalities that are often mentioned don't exist in practice. If you look at the economics of it, the government would never admit that, of course, but they don't. But what you get now with all the consequences of prohibition are genuine externalities, right? You got genuine problems. The government is just spending, I think, £240 million or so of taxpayers' money to try and enforce these new bans, with a new ban on vaping and also to supposedly do some public health information campaign about vaping. You can imagine what that's going to say, can't you, considering the rubbish is talked about vaping in Australia. So these things are genuinely now costing taxpayers money and leading to more criminality. Mm-hmm. They're the externalities. Like, it's a policy choice. There's a very clear option here. You can just leave people the hell alone. You could just leave people alone and say, look, if you want to smoke, you smoke. You've been warned. The tax is very high. We're going to bring it down a bit.
There's a lot fewer of you than there used to be.
Yeah, right.
It's not a pressing social issue in any real sense.
Yeah, we've done all we can. If you want to smoke, just smoke. We're not going to keep making things worse for everybody by driving forward this extreme agenda. But no, they'll never do that.
But I suppose the good thing is, as long as they're obsessing on cigarettes, they're not getting on to other things like booze, which I'd rather they left well alone. So maybe we should think that.
Definitely next,
And to your point, Nick, it was what drives this desire to get rid of smoking. I feel like, if anything, the treatment of vaping shows it was never really about cost of the health service or anything else to begin with. Because I think according to, it was either NHS or Public Health England figures, which were naturally quite conservative, they would always say it was 95% safer. So that kind of thought experiment, imagine if they could invent a cigarette tomorrow that was basically safe. Would they still want to ban it? In the case of vaping, the answer, at least in places like Australia, has been an overwhelming yes. But we should move on to another topic that you wanted to talk today about, Chris, which was the alleged scourge of ultra-processed food. So people were already kind of heard a lot of commentary and a lot of concern about processed food. Now we've got ultra-processed, this new terrifying form of it. And you wrote something for your Substack, which was kind of hooked off of a particularly absurd piece in the Daily Mail about Coco Pops. Coco Pops and bread, and they're terrifyingly addictive and soft, nice qualities. But also just looking at the issue in general. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you found there?
Yeah, so this is the latest fad, really, in nutrition. There needs to be a new fad comes along once every few years so people can get selling books. There's at least 2 books out about ultra-processed food at the moment. People immediately say, what is ultra-processed food? I'll try and explain. I mean, the shortened version, which is used by proponents of this term, is as simple as anything that's wrapped in plastic, any food that's wrapped in plastic and contains at least one ingredient you wouldn't have in your kitchen. Right, so it's very scientific, that's clearly how you would define a dangerous food. So straight away, it's kind of preying on ignorance, isn't it? It's like, well, if you don't recognize this particular term. I mean, one of the ones that this guy mentions in the Daily Mail is ascorbic acid, because we've just got ascorbic acid. Do you know what ascorbic acid is? It's vitamin C. Literally all it is, just the another name for vitamin C. So people are easily scared off by E numbers and things like that. And obviously it's possible that these chemicals might be dangerous, but they have been tested quite rigorous to make sure they're not dangerous. So what does it come down to? Well, basically what it comes down to is the idea that these foods are very palatable. They're tasty. And if you make food that's very tasty, people will tend to eat more of it. And there's a famous randomized control trial that basically proved this a few years ago, which all these ultra-processed food people go on about, because the people who were given the unprocessed meals lost a bit of weight during this experiment. The people who were given the ultra-processed meals gained weight. But they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted of this stuff. So it's not terribly surprising, to me at least, that people who are given salted peanuts and chocolate are going to consume more calories than if they're given blueberries and Ryvita. But supposedly this is the killer evidence. So this guy, Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, who is one of the Van Tulleken brothers, who are like TV doctors for kids, he said he sort of did a super size me on himself. He put himself on an ultra-processed food diet for a month and then wrote about it for the Daily Mail. I suspect slightly exaggerating, the depths of misery that this put him through, and the supposed addictiveness, and he couldn't stop eating Coco Pops and so on. And he's particularly obsessed, for some reason, he's got obsessed with brown bread. Which technically is an ultra-processed food, right? And if I was trying to have a go at this concept, I would use something like brown bread as a good example of why this concept is ridiculous. I'd say, well, hang on, from your definition, even a bit of Hovis wholemeal bread would be bad. He's kind of just taken that and run with it. I mean, he deliberately put that at the fore of his campaign, at the risk of making himself look preposterous, I would say. But he's saying, it's really... brown bread is really dangerous because you can eat it too quickly because it's so soft. Like, people are just gorging on slice after slice of brown bread. And then he went on TV and said that the way we eat bread now, the way we make bread now, supermarket bread, processed bread with preservatives and emulsifiers, it has led to our jaws getting smaller. And that's why we all need to wear braces and have to have our wisdom teeth taken out. I thought, what the hell is this nonsense? It turns out there's some study that suggests that a Neanderthal man had kind of fewer teeth and possibly better aligned teeth than people do today, and that might be because they were spent all their time like eating raw meat and having to chew it a lot. But this is not an issue of Hovis, prepared sliced bread. So the whole thing is weird, but you can see it catching on, I guess. The guy who invented the concept, some Brazilian scientist, he only coined the term, I think, in 2018. It's taken off really quickly. He's very much in favor of strict controls and even the outright criminalization of some ultra-processed food. So I guess this is the thing, food control people, the anti-obesity, the people who want to clamp down on the food supply. This is the kind of thing they've been waiting for, because the problem for people who've always wanted to treat food like tobacco or indeed alcohol or gambling, it was always quite hard to define, like, the bad food that supposedly makes us fat. Now they've got this definition. It happens to be a really broad definition that covers about half of what people eat. Well, literally, at least half of what people eat. As I said, including things like bread. So it's conceivable now that they could start pushing for the tobacco style regulation, health warnings, tax rises, and all the rest of it.
It was fascinating, Chris, especially because some of the quotes in that piece were hilarious. So he kind of paints this hellscape image of him giving his daughter Coco Pops for the first time because she kind of demands it. She's never seen such exciting food before in her life. And so she starts gorging on it. And at one point he describes her as her eating wasn't just mindless, it was trance-like.
Yeah.
This kind of image of them both like rolling around on the floor, unable to deal with this particular food stuff.
Yeah, and then he himself had 5 bowls of it in a row. I don't know what these people eat. He genuinely seems like he's never eaten Coco Pops before. And that seems very hard to believe.
Well, it's like, it's kind of important that young people start to drink before they're 18, just so they get a bit used to it.
Right. Yeah.
All these people who grew up in, impeccably kind of bourgeois surrounds, and so they've only ever eaten like granola and such, like, they're going to go wild as soon as they get some actual ultra processed stuff in front of them. Maybe that's the moral of this particular story.
Clearly, yeah, it's like exactly. It's like giving taking an American a university to the play.
They can't deal with it.
It is definitely a snobbery about this, isn't it? It's a hatred of the poor, rather sneering at poor people. But because the thing about processed foods are they are cheap and they make food available in larger quantities to people who would otherwise not afford it, and I think that's behind a lot of it.
And that discomfort with food that's kind of made at scale, factories, and all the things that essentially make food cheaper, tastier, more choice and so on that people can enjoy now is what brings these people out in hives. It is fascinating that we have that. And there's probably plenty more we could say about this, but I want to move on to our final topic, which is also a pretty chunky one, which I specifically wanted Nick to come on to talk about here, which is something which probably won't be on many of our listeners' radar, but I think is really fascinating coming out of Australia, which is this debate around the voice to Parliament. There is going to be, a referendum slated for this year that at least the Labour government has pledged towards essentially providing a kind of advisory board, a kind of council constitutionally enshrined for Indigenous Australians to shape policy. The details of it have never been entirely clear. But Nick, do you want to give us a little bit of background to this initiative and where we're at with this particular discussion?
This whole thing began about 16 years ago with the idea that the Australian Constitution should have some recognition that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were here first. They are the original occupants of this land. And a lot of us had no great problem with that. We weren't quite sure what it would do in the Constitution, but it seemed quite a reasonable thing to put in. But of course, as usual, claims grow. Their AMBIC claim grows, and we now got to the point where they want not just recognition, but a voice, meaning a voice to Parliament. They wanted the idea, Indigenous people should be able to speak to the Parliament. And the problem with this is, of course, that they do have a voice already, like the rest of us. They can vote, and there are indeed 11 MPs and senators who claim they are Indigenous, I should say, and that's greater proportion than they would be if it was just per capita. So there are enormous problems with this thing. But basically, the basic problem is that you're giving a certain group of people, on the basis of biology or race, an extra voice to Parliament. Most of us just get one vote. They're going to have this body that will in some way be able to talk directly to politicians. And if the politicians don't listen, they can go to the High Court and say they've not listened to us. It becomes very difficult. It changes the whole way we're governed here. And I think a lot of us, the more we hear about it, it just is fundamentally against the thing that I signed up to as an Australian citizen, and that is egalitarianism. We're all equal, right? You don't make distinctions for people on the basis of race or ethnicity. I guess people feel there's a special case to be made for Indigenous Australians, but then you get to the point, who are Indigenous Australians? Is it somebody who's got, I'm half English and half Scottish by heritage, so what am I, English or Scottish? I solve that by becoming an Australian citizen and say, well, we're all Australians, right? That is what joins us together. It's turned into a most bitter, horrible argument here. As you say, it goes to a referendum later this year. A bit like Brexit in the sense that everybody in the elite, every corporation, every football team is saying, well, we've got to give voice to Aboriginal people. But ordinary people are not buying it, and it's probably about 50-50 now in the polls. So it hasn't gone the way they think. And, my judgment of it is that it won't get up. The bar's quite high. You've got to get a majority of people in the majority of states, and that's quite a hard bar to jump. And it's split. No referendum's ever got up unless there was bipartisan support. In this case, there isn't. But it's been contaminated by the Black Lives Matter movement, all this identity politics. And I think it's really taken us down completely the wrong track on this. We should be moving towards genuine reconciliation, which is, helping Indigenous people. Probably about 10% of Indigenous people live in remote communities who are in genuine difficulty with health, education, and so forth. But instead, it's just becoming a very, very horrible identity politics exercise.
And it does seem, as you say, that essentially this is being presented as a very black and white issue. It's being something as you're on the right side of history or you're on the wrong side of history. But from what I gather, there's a lot of people in the no camp who are prominent Aboriginal or Indigenous politicians and figures themselves. So it's really not as clear cut as that, is it?
No, indeed. I guess the most prominent no campaigner is a woman called Jacinta Price, who's of Aboriginal descent, comes from Alice Springs. And she says, well, this is going to make no difference to my people on the ground. And besides, I consider myself Australian above everything else. And there are others like Warren Mundine in that camp. So the Indigenous community is split, the Aboriginal community is split, definitely. And I think it's a bit, it's no different, if you like, to every other debate. You have your urban elite, your Aboriginal urban elite, and they're doing pretty well. You know, it's very hard to distinguish them from other people in terms of their economic outcomes and work and so forth. And then you've got the rural and regional and remote Aboriginals who are really the outsiders in all this. And all they want is, you know, a bit of peace and quiet and less violence, less grog, less domestic violence, and the rights to own their own home and own their own land, which, of course, they're completely banned from doing. It's like a sort of communist existence out there in the central parts of Australia. It's quite it is quite horrible. And what we found here, and this is a similar thing that's happened in America and Canada, is every time we do a census, there's a massive increase in the number of Indigenous people. And it's not that a lot more are being born, because suddenly you'll find that the Aboriginal people over 55, for instance, will go shooting up. It is definitely an identity thing that people are seeing. That's now a good thing to identify as Indigenous. And there's certain benefits, of course, in doing this. And it does lead to the question, well, who is Indigenous? Who really is? I mean, if you think, well, something terrible happened in 1788 when Captain Cook came, what material disadvantage are you facing now that for which you need some sort of reward? Or if you do think you need to be rewarded by other Australians or need to be compensated by other Australians, what about, for instance, a young woman who works for me whose father came out here as a refugee from communist Vietnam, fled the communists in Vietnam? What has 1788 got to do with her? The whole historical guilt thing, of course, it's running very hot, but is really problematic in a society which really used to bind itself together by the idea we're all Australian. We all should be on an equal level.
That's such an important point as well, because as you were suggesting, the more you kind of allow for this identity politics to like dilute your ideas of citizenship and what it is to be a member of a nation, the uglier and kind of racialized it gets. Like, is it just going to be what the one drop rule is what qualifies you to have this kind of extra representation? But it's interesting because it seems like at least the most explicit example I've come across of an attempt to kind of do away with one person, one vote, but for allegedly progressive reasons, you know, not seeing how questionable that is. You know, previously you might have allocated, or society's definitely allocated, you know, more of a democratic clout to people because they own property or because they were men or so on. But now it's on the basis of victimhood. But even so, it's only really the kind of self-appointed leaders of that victimized group. It's not the people who are actually, you know, on the ground, as you've been pointing to.
The ones that in every you know, material sense are not actually disadvantaged at all. They're the elite. But this is the first step, apparently, towards a treaty and truth-telling. And truth-telling I like, except it won't be truth-telling. It'll be fabrication of Australian history to make white men look terrible from day one. But as for the treaty, well, that is really difficult in Australia because there are some 500 Aboriginal nations. If you want to, they're not nations in the sense we'd think of nations. They are just different groups, different clans. I mean, it was a hunter-gatherer society. It was divided into clans and tribes. And the problem from day one, from 1788 when they arrived, is, well, who do you strike the deal with? You know, it just doesn't make any sense in the Australian context. And, you know, the idea that we've really run since 1788 is that everybody should be assimilated and be Australian. You know, you can be your individual heritage, your individual culture, but basically you should have the same rights as everybody else and be able to be part of the place, part of the economy, a solid citizen. This, of course, kicks against it. And so there's very strong feelings on both sides. I mean, but a lot of us feel very uncomfortable about this the closer we get to the referendum. But on the other side, you've got the yes campaigners who are calling us all, you know, racist and divisive and the usual kind of insults. It just feels to me very much like the Brexit campaign in that regard.
And Chris, before we move on to the postbag, is there any points, questions on this particular issue?
Well, yeah, just quickly, Nick, I don't understand what this person or these people are supposed to do with their voice? Are they essentially just like politicians, or do they just get to turn up and they get first dibs at questioning people? I don't get it.
The idea they're trying to persuade us is it's some kind of kumbaya group. Well, first of all, how can you have an Aboriginal voice? One person or one group of people who represent the entirety of Aboriginal opinion. I mean, it's insulting, isn't it? And Jacinta Price, who I mentioned, the Aboriginal woman who's opposed to this, and she's a senator, she said to Penny Wong, our foreign minister, she said, I think we should have an Asian voice, Penny. We should have an Asian voice to Parliament, and then I'd know what your people really want. It just becomes terribly patronising. In Victoria, interestingly, where they have already got one of these in the state parliament, it's just become a hotbed of factionalism. It's just full of groups that are trying to take it over. So to me, that does away with any idea that this could in any way be a genuine representation of what Aboriginal people think or feel or want. It's a power grab in the end. It just is a nonsense, really, in my view.
Fascinating. We'll continue to watch that unfurl with a mix of interest and horror as this goes forward. But we should just quickly get to some, or at least one postbag question.
Postbag. It's bulging, eh?
And there's one here which I've got to pick out just because it's doing the rounds last night, which is that George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, someone who, on many different respects, is not particularly well loved, shall we say, has come out with his latest policy suggestion pronouncement, which is that we should ban smoking, essentially, that it's time to ban smoking. He's also suggested that his sugar tax, which he implemented in government, the government should finish the job and extend it to fruit juices, another scourge that is being visited upon our society, of course. Chris, I know you're not going to be a fan of this particular proposal, but yes, some thoughts.
He was speaking to the Times Health Commission or something. The Times is running some committee with the great and the good. There's Lord Darcy in there and Henry Dimbleby and Matthew Taylor, all these kind of people, these Angocrats and Sikh fillers, philosopher kings. And he went along to speak to them. Yeah. I don't know what's going on. I mean, as soon as this came up on Twitter yesterday, people immediately found pictures of him smoking not very long ago. I don't know if he still smokes. I wouldn't be surprised.
He wasn't a particularly clean-living youngster, as I remember.
No, he loved cigarettes for amongst many other things, as I understand it. In fact, most of that government were smokers, really. David Cameron was a smoker, wasn't he? Probably still is.
Gove is still a smoker.
Gove is still a secret smoker. Osborne, by the looks of it, is still a smoker. I don't know. What can you say about it? I mean, obviously he's in no position to make this happen. It would be a disaster if it did, for reasons we've already discussed in the show. But he's so rich. He doesn't need to answer to anybody. He can say what he wants. And yet what he chooses to say is we should tax orange juice and ban smoking. I mean, it's just this is the kind of intellectual level of these people. After all these years, you think you'd have some kind of interesting original ideas or thoughts or some kind of, interpretation of events or something about the big issues of our day. But no, it's let's tax orange juice and ban smoking. It's just depressing more than anything.
Well, I suppose, Nick, at least shows that, and it feeds into what we've been talking about with Australia, really, is that this prohibitionist stuff, they really do believe in it. This isn't something which they've outsourced to someone. At the end of the day, they think they should just ban all these things and be done with it.
Yeah, do you know what? I think that COVID has got a lot to answer for because we gave them license in COVID, and they took license anyway to boss us around and tell us what we could and could not do. And I suspect that what we're seeing now is that they rather like that. They rather like being in charge, and now they're pushing it on things like orange juice, for goodness sake. I mean, I just don't. I thought that was full of vitamin C. We were supposed to enjoy it. You're a connoisseur of the Nanny State, Chris, but do you think they've gained extra courage through their success during that horrible period of COVID, and they now think they can force anything on us, and they're really just doing it because they enjoy the power rather than any good they're actually going to do with this stuff?
Yeah, I do think that's definitely part of it. They've seen what they can get away with. It's probably no coincidence that old Jacinda introduced her tobacco prohibition plan straight after that she'd had an incredibly compliant population during her extensive lockdowns. So I think that is an element of it. I think it would happen anyway, quite honestly. I mean, it's always been the obvious and logical conclusion to the anti-smoking campaign, no matter how much these campaigners lied along the way and say, of course we respect adults' right to smoke, this is only about protecting kids, it's only about regulating the industry. Anyone with any sense knew that this was nonsense, that they would always push for prohibition. And all I would say is, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. They're going to do it again with other things, right? They're using exactly the same template with gambling, with alcohol, potentially with ultra-processed food. The ultimate and logical end goal will always be the same. Not to say they'll get there, but that is the logical conclusion to it, to completely prohibit these things. So, we've seen how it works, and we shouldn't make it so easy from the second time.
On that note, we're completely out of time, but Chris, Nick, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Chris.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.